Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Talia Marcheggiani. I'm a naturopathic doctor and also a registered psychotherapist qualifying. And we're back with another episode of the Good Mood podcast / YouTube video. And I have taken a long hiatus. I was in the midst of doing coursework for my master's degree. Now I have the psychotherapy coursework finished and I'm starting a practicum. But I wanted to, in honor of this video that I have on YouTube that I was thinking of redoing, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I am going to do a podcast on neurotransmitters and neuromodulators because it's been a while since I've done a podcast, and I feel like this would be a really great topic. It might be a long episode as we dive into the weeds. If you're listening to this podcast, feel free to jump over to YouTube because there's an actual PowerPoint I'm going to be sharing with some beautiful visuals, and hopefully we learn lots. So, welcome. So, as I stated, I had this YouTube video that I did in 2016 called Amino Acid Therapy for Mental Health and Addictions. So it's a 2016 video. It's about 20 minutes, and it has 41,000 views at this to date. And I have always been thinking about redoing this video because I practice differently now. Everyone's very passionate about the topic. Apparently, it's probably my most popular video, and I have a quite unfortunate haircut in this video. So I listened to it recently and I thought, let's just record a whole new video. Rather than redoing this one, I wanted to talk, rather than amino acids, to talk more about neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and to talk about how I see them, how they fit into my practice, how a naturopathic doctor kind of works with neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, and to give you the backstory on my favorite neurotransmitter neuromodulators, or arguably the more important ones where it pertains to mental health. And then because we're talking about neurotransmitters, ultimately, when we're talking about amino acids, we're talking about neurotransmitters because that is the role that amino acid therapy for mental health and addictions plays, is it helps to balance neurotransmitters in the brain by providing the precursors or the backbone of specific neurotransmitters, like the monoamines. So let's talk about neurotransmitters today. Neurotransmitters are signaling molecules. Okay, and they work on the nervous system. So our nervous system is located in our brain, in our spinal cord. That's our central nervous system. And then our peripheral nervous system is like all of our nerves that go through every organ, every corner of the body. And neurotransmitters, they are these chemicals that communicate between nerve cells. So nerve cells, they look like these trees with branches and a long stem and roots, and they send out, and then the space between them is called the cleft, the synaptic cleft. So you have the presynaptic neuron that releases neurotransmitters to the postsynaptic neuron. And these are neurotransmitters. And so, they are things like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine and epinephrine, or noradrenaline and adrenaline. I'm just going to say norepinephrine for this lecture because I hate so noradrenaline and adrenaline are the same thing, and epinephrine and norepinephrine or epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. So I'm just going to call it norepinephrine, epinephrine. I like that name better, even though maybe adrenaline is the more colloquial term. It's literally the same thing. We have acetylcholine and GABA and glutamates. We're going to talk about those ones today. We also have neuromodulators. So certain neurotransmitters, like the monoamines, can be neuromodulators. Neuromodulators are not necessarily released in the synaptic cleft, but they are influencing the transmission of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. So they're organizing and they're influencing the action of the neuron that they're working on. For all intents and purposes, they're the same thing, but just know that it's not so cut and dry. But basically, you could think of a neurotransmitter as like you're passing a ball around a baseball field, right? So you have the catcher or whatever, the pitcher throws the ball to the catcher. And so, the ball is floating in space and it's communicating this message between the players on the field. And a neuromodulator might be more like something that influences the catcher, like whether it's the glove that's about to open, or how hard the ball is thrown, or how many balls are thrown, that type of thing. The monoamines are very relevant for mood. So these are sort of the molecules of emotion, you could think of them as, and they include dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine and epinephrine. They're called monoamines because they have an amino acid backbone. So for example, you have tryptophan, which is an amino acid, and it is found, we're going to talk more about tryptophan, but tryptophan's found in like poultry, in egg yolks, and pumpkin seeds. It's not as prevalent in plant foods, but it's highly prevalent in poultry. So turkey, this is why people always talk about getting that like post-Thanksgiving, coma where they feel really relaxed and chilled out. So tryptophan gets made into 5-HTP, which is an intermediary neurotransmitter or amino acid, and then that gets made into serotonin. So these monoamines, like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, start off as an amino acid and then get built from there. And these amino acids come from our diet. Let's talk about serotonin first. I should have worn my serotonin necklace. I have a serotonin necklace. The chemical structure of serotonin is pretty cool looking. So it is a monoamine. It is, it's one of the ones that we hear about a lot. Its nickname is the happiness hormone or the happiness neurotransmitter. It's not as like catchy to say happiness neurotransmitter. People call it the happiness hormone. Now, I don't know if so serotonin, I think it's kind of like the contentment hormone more than happiness, because it depends how you define happiness. Like that feeling of elation, excitement, drive is more dopamine. So like meaning, purpose, that waking up in the morning feeling great, that is more dopamine. Serotonin is like lying on the grass, soaking into the earth, feeling the sun on your skin, and having nowhere else in the world that you need to be or want to be than where you are in that moment. Serotonin is sort of this chemical of having. And so it's kind of like the sunshine hormone. And it doesn't just regulate mood, though. It's also involved in movement and sleep regulation. It's released from virtually every neuron. Like it's involved in all of the nervous system. It has big actions in our gut. In fact, 90% of our serotonin is made in the gut, although that serotonin doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of us talk, like you hear a lot of people who are very educated, knowledgeable in neurotransmitters and brain chemistry, who will talk about like serotonin and the gut-brain connection, and how the gut-brain connection is really important for your mental health, which it is. But they might cite this fact that 90% of serotonin is made in the gut as one of the reasons why your gut and your brain are so, the gut-brain connection is so important for mental health. And so serotonin is really important for gut function, and 90% of serotonin is made in the gut, but that serotonin doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, so it doesn't necessarily influence our mood directly. It may influence our mood through the nervous system in the gut, which is connected to our brain, and might be influenced, can calm us down for sure. We have the vagus nerve from the gut to the brain that has a calming effect, a parasympathetic effect. So maybe serotonin is calming us, like gut serotonin is calming us down in that way. But serotonin is involved in motility, right? So having regular bowel movements. And there are some hypotheses that IBS is caused by lack of serotonin in the gut. And this is why you see this correlation with IBS and mood issues. So like anxiety and IBS go hand in hand, that kind of like you feel it in your gut type connection. So we make serotonin from tryptophan, found in poultry, pumpkin seeds, egg yolks. And then it gets converted to 5-HTP, which you can buy as a supplement. And then that 5-HTP gets converted to serotonin, and then the serotonin gets converted to melatonin, which is our sleep hormone and also a really important antioxidant. Now, these steps require cofactors. Cofactors are nutrients, vitamins, and minerals that are involved in making sure these steps happen, like factory workers, like people that are actually assembling the amino acid into, the next molecule. So tryptophan to 5-HTP, 5-HTP to serotonin. And so these conversion steps require iron, magnesium, zinc, B6, calcium, folate, or vitamin B9. And so this is the theory when we're talking about naturopathic medicine. Like when people get supplements, this is the idea, is that by supplementing something like 5-HTP, we're going to be influencing the body's biochemical pathways to produce more serotonin. And certainly if you are deficient in tryptophan, this could, supplementing or eating more tryptophan could have a big impact on your body's ability to make serotonin. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid, meaning that we don't make it. And so it has to come from food. Same with iron. We need iron. So when people are iron deficient, do you have enough iron to make the serotonin that you need? Same with magnesium, very common nutrient deficiency. Zinc is another really common nutrient deficiency. Vitamin B6, which we're going to hear a lot of. Vitamin B6 is peroxidine, is another name for it, and it's not as well known as vitamin B12, but it is essential for making the neurotransmitters that we're going to learn about. So serotonin is involved in, because it sort of encompasses all of our nervous system, it's involved in a whole bunch of different things like mood and emotions. And it's kind of this satisfaction, contentment. It's involved in shutting off the OCD circuit. So OCD, I talk about this in another podcast, but OCD has a circuit that involves different brain regions like the orbitofrontal cortex. And it's kind of like the alarm bell centers of the brain, that feeling like something's wrong, all is not well, you got to do something, you got to fix something. So with serotonin in your system, it shuts off that circuit and it kind of calms everything down. And that's why, like, if you talk to anyone who's played around or experimented or taken any of the tryptamines, because another name for serotonin is 5-hydroxytryptamine, and tryptamines are certain brain chemicals that involve, it's a class of neurochemicals like psilocybin, DMT, which is found in ayahuasca or in one of the plants that's brewed for ayahuasca. And so people that take these sort of tryptamine psychedelics will often talk about this feeling of like, I don't need to be anywhere. I don't need to do anything. Like everything is great. Everything's fantastic. There's kind of like a vibe with activating these serotonin receptors. So tryptamines like psilocybin will activate serotonin receptors. And we have many, many serotonin receptors in our body. And so, yeah, they're involved in mood, emotions, this feeling of satisfaction, contentment, involved in movement and regulating movement, the sleep-wake cycle. Mostly melatonin is involved in that. So melatonin is it pulses from our pineal gland to help us sleep, regulate our circadian rhythms, which are essential for mood. It regulates body temperature, appetite, bowel movement, blood clotting, pain perception, bone development, heart function. And a lot of it is present in plasma cells, which was emphasized in a conference I just attended. And they were talking about how measuring platelets. So measuring platelets, like people with elevated platelets might be absorbing or recycling more serotonin, and that might be correlated with depression. There's not like hard data on this yet, but it's a hypothesis that's being explored, is like looking at platelets because it's a really easy test that's essentially done in every blood test that's ever been done, right? Because it's part of our complete blood count. We look at platelets. And so people with a lot of platelets might be absorbing more serotonin. So low serotonin is thought to be involved as part of the disease process in obsessive compulsive disorder, in migraines, in anxiety and depression, constipation, IBS. And that is why the first class or the number one prescribed medications for depression and anxiety are the SSRI medications, and to a lesser extent, SNRI. So these are the first line treatments for depression and anxiety. And it stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI, and SNRI stands for selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And what these do is they block the reuptake of serotonin, because what happens is, so you release serotonin from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neurons. You have a lot of serotonin in the synaptic cleft, and that serotonin eventually is recycled back into the presynaptic neuron. And the SSRIs prevent the reuptake of serotonin, or in the cases of SNRIs, also norepinephrine, into the presynaptic cleft. So you have like more serotonin hanging out in the synaptic cleft, in the space between the neurons, for longer. And so this is thought to increase levels of serotonin in the brain. And that is thought to treat things like OCD, migraines, anxiety, depression, and possibly IBS. Sometimes SSRIs are prescribed for IBS, though it's not really a first line therapy. We have 15 serotonin receptors in our body. And it's interesting to note that the 5-HT1A receptors that SSRIs activate are, and this is according to the research of a man called Robin Carhart Harris, who's a psychedelic researcher. And he found that the 5-HT1A receptors are involved in something called passive coping. So let's say you're depressed, you hate your boss, you don't like your relationship, life just sucks, you don't have enough money. SSRIs are thought that, or activating the 5-TH1A receptors is thought to allow us to kind of just deal, to not feel as miserable about the situation that we're in. It's this passive coping. You don't really change anything about the situation, but you feel differently about it. And you can see how that would benefit your mood, right? It's kind of like, I don't like my job, but I'm not as stressed out and horrified by it. Like I'm okay. I'll just stay in this job. It's not going to necessarily bring me joy, but it's going to remove that negative affect and at least maybe bring me to neutral or lessen the negative experience I have regarding the situation in my life. Whereas psychedelics like psilocybin, they activate 5-HT2A receptors, which are serotonin receptors involved in adaptive or active coping. So you hate your job. Now you feel the impulse, the motivation, or the wherewithal to start looking for a new job, or maybe it's something about the self-confidence. So there's something about this neuroplasticity that allows us to find alternate pathways. So you can even think of it like when you're at a roadblock, you can either just chill out and be like, you know what, I'll just stay right here. I can't move any farther. I'm just going to accept my circumstances. Or you can start to find ways to bypass the roadblock, which is what this active or adaptive coping provides. And so, and now one is not necessarily better than the other. They're both necessary for moving past a depressed state. Ultimately, we have to, acceptance and humility, but also this sense of agency are really important for mental health. So, with the 5-HT1A receptors, you have this sort of like acceptance, this humility, this maybe even gratitude if you can get there, or at least not this feeling of like everything sucks. And then with the 5-HT2A receptors, now you're in this state of like agency, self-efficacy, you have hope, and now you might be taking action to change something. So I thought that was really cool. Robin Carhart Harris has a lot of really interesting things he talks about regarding psychedelics and like neurochemistry. Now, serotonin gets recycled through a few enzymes. So you can think of these as like, recycling systems. Like they kind of filter neurotransmitters, break them down, recycle them. One of the more meaningful, I guess, or like relevant ones is MAO-A, so monoamine oxidase A. And that degrades or breaks down serotonin. So it manages the levels of serotonin in the body. MAO-A blockers or MAO inhibitors are, it was like an old class of antidepressants, but because there's so many monoamines, like histamine, you couldn't eat a lot of food because a lot of food has things like tyramine and histamine. And so if you were on a MAO blocker, you were at risk of having really high levels of histamine and tyramine because of certain foods like aged cheeses, wine, and things like that. So it really prevents you from being able to eat a lot of food if you're on a MAO inhibitor. So they're not used as much anymore, and they're not as specific, right? Because we have so many monoamines that at least SSRIs are more specific in their action on just serotonin reuptake. But anyways, we degrade serotonin through MAO-A, and it's interesting to note that we have different speeds. So we have something called genetic individuality, where we have these SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, just throwing out all the terms for everyone, that might influence how fast we break down serotonin. So you can imagine if you break down serotonin really quickly, you might be at risk for lower serotonin levels, right? You might need to constantly be stimulating serotonin in order to feel this contentment, satisfaction, or to get these other serotonin dependent pathways done. If you are slow MAO clearer, or like you have a slow MAO enzyme, so you clear serotonin more slowly, you will have more serotonin potentially in your system. And it's interesting to note that estrogen slows MAO-A. And so when people are, men have a ton, actually, I think it's more estrogen in their brains than women. So this is relevant for men and women. But what's relevant for women is that estrogen cycles throughout the month. So, around ovulation, we get a big surge of estrogen, and that typically is associated with a positive mood state. You can imagine if it's, no matter how fast your own genetic individuality is, how fast you degrade serotonin, like how fast your MAO enzyme is, you get this slower clearance of serotonin around the time that your estrogen is surging. And then we often get this other spot. So you feel better. You might experience a positive mood state. And then in the luteal phase, so about a week before menstruating, before the start of a new cycle, there'll be another surge of estrogen. And then there's a drop of estrogen right before menstruation. And so this might be, in some people, correlated with the symptoms of PMS, post or premenstrual syndrome, and possibly there's many hypotheses about what causes premenstrual dysphoric disorder. That's not just serotonin involved, but it could also be associated with PMDD. And SSRIs, it's interesting to note, are off-label treatments for PMS and PMDD. And so I always think, like, what's estrogen doing? Like, is somebody is somebody like skyrocketing their estrogen? Like, are they having a big surge of estrogen and then a big drop of estrogen that's causing this destabilization of their mood, and then causing this like kind of carb cravings, dark depression, premenstrual migraines, premenstrual constipation? I had one patient, and this is actually a thing in the research, like facial distortion, looking in the mirror, not really recognizing yourself, or feeling, it's not really like feeling ugly, but it's like feeling kind of like, I don't know, or I'm looking at my face differently. Another symptom of this drop in serotonin before the period. So for some women, this can be really extreme and really disturbing. It can last up to 2 weeks before your cycle. And so this is an interesting theory or way into treating this. If we're asking more questions and understanding that they seem to be having these real serotonin drops, then we might be looking at serotonin pathways to support their PMS and PMDD. It's super. Okay, so this is the work of someone called Charles Raison. He did a study where he had people with depression. He put them in a sauna, or like heat therapy, and he heated their body to 38.5 degrees. And he found that if they did that for, I believe it was an hour, that their Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, which is a 52-point scale that is used to quantify someone's depression. It like quantifies depression from mild to moderate to severe. He found that an hour of heat therapy, just 1 hour, one time, dropped their Hamilton Depression Rating Scale 6 points. And I believe the effects lasted for a period of weeks, something like 6 weeks. And this is so interesting because the average SSRI might drop someone's Hamilton Depression Rating Scale by about almost 2 points. And so this was a 3-time influence, like a 3-time greater effect than an antidepressant. And it was just a one-time treatment. This was a pilot study, meaning that they didn't do it on very many people. They did have a control group, which is really interesting. So they I believe they put people in a heated blanket, but didn't heat it. But then they asked them if they thought they were getting heat, and they said yes. So like, it's interesting what our mind can tell us. So they heated up one group and didn't heat the other, but they put both groups in the heating blanket. And yeah, they saw this 6-point drop on the HDRS, which could bring somebody from severe to moderate or moderate to mild depression or mild to no depression. It's a significant drop. And so it's hypothesized that heat stimulates through receptors in our skin that go to the raphe nucleus in the brain, stimulates serotonin production, and has an antidepressant effect. And they also found that it has an anti-inflammatory effect too, to really heat somebody up. Now, heating you up to 38.5 degrees is pretty significant. Like, that's a pretty uncomfortable, like, I don't think their heads were heated. They were drinking water the whole time. They were being monitored for electrolytes, but they were very likely highly uncomfortable. So I don't suggest going into a sauna for an hour until you pass out, but we can use heat therapy. We can use light therapy potentially to stimulate serotonin. And we know that like serotonin has a role in temperature regulation. And so, this is a very naturopathic idea, is like heating somebody up to generate more serotonin production. It's like using our body's homeostatic mechanisms to get an effect that we want, to bring somebody out of an imbalanced state if someone's not making enough serotonin. And so you can see my pictures. These are like the serotonin vibes, Now, love and bonding is more oxytocin, but serotonin has like feel good, heart opening, like just chilling on the grass, just, enjoying yourself kind of vibes. So when I think of the happiness hormone, to tell you the truth, think more of dopamine. And there's a book called Molecule of More, which is fantastic. I highly recommend it. And it's about dopamine. And it really like it's surprising how many things are related to dopamine, from religious experiences to scientific discoveries, the sense of awe, wanting, right? So it's the molecule of wanting. And whereas serotonin is more associated with having, and it's drive, it's motivation, it's positive emotion, it's reward. It's like why I'm doing this podcast, most likely. It's the wanting to do things. It's like moving toward a goal. I guess I was watching my dog in the dog park the other day, and when he's just chilling, like sometimes he's 14 years old. So sometimes he'll go and he'll just lie on the grass in the sun. And I just kind of think like, that's a serotonin dog state. But then if you throw a ball or a stick, he'll run after it, single focus, and he's so happy and he's playing, and that's more of a dopamine dog state. So it's the molecule of play. It's the molecule of creativity. It's a wonderful molecule. And when we talk about depression, when I ask people, because it's interesting to think of how depression and anxiety are these kind of words we throw around, but what I'm interested in as an ND, as a naturopathic doctor, and as a psychotherapist, is I want to know, like, what's your actual experience? Like, okay, you say you have anxiety, you were diagnosed with it, you might even take medication for it, but like, maybe you've had it your entire life, but like, what actually do you mean? Like, what do you experience? What are your symptoms? But also, what is the experience of having anxiety, which is often related to could be related to low serotonin, but what's your experience of having depression? And a lot of the time people will say, yeah, it's like life is meaningless. I have no motivation. I don't want to get out of bed in the morning. I don't feel happy, like even things that normally made me happy, right? All of these, like this apathy, this this low movement, kind of lethargic state. This to me speaks of dopamine. I've had patients, ADHD is involved in low dopamine. And I've had patients tell me like their motivation was so low that they would pick something up, like an empty cup, and they wanted to bring the empty cup to the kitchen, but they would just kind of like, they'd pick it up and then they would just kind of like put it down in between wherever they'd picked it up from in the kitchen. And they're just like, yeah, I just lost this will, drive, caring. And it's often hard to think if you have low dopamine. It's hard to find words because it's associated with like executive functioning, which we'll talk about when we get to the next neurotransmitter. So yeah, dopamine's a big deal. It's does a lot in terms of mood and motivation. It's a huge molecule when we're talking about like happiness, this sense of purpose, like this idea of happiness that we have, at least in North American society, I think is more of a dopamine phenomenon than serotonin, which is more about like contentment, warm cups of tea, drink tea and watch the rain, lie on the grass in the sun. It's more of a serotonin, like a hygge, what the Danish call hygge, like a coziness. Like it's more of a serotonin thing. Whereas like we took happy, like I'm happy, I'm excited, I can't wait, it's gonna be great. That's dopamine. Passion, dopamine. And so we make dopamine by taking tyrosine, which is an amino acid, converting it to L-DOPA, which is actually a Parkinson's drug. And then L-DOPA gets converted to dopamine. And then dopamine goes to make norepinephrine and epinephrine. So it gets it's degraded, but it's converting into different molecules, our fight or flight molecules. And these steps require B6. There's that B6 again, iron again. And I just think of so many people in my practice who are iron deficient, who have low iron. And I have an iron video about how copper and vitamin A are needed for iron recycling and iron uptake. And BH4, which is like bihydra or biopterin, tetrahydrobiopterin. And biopterin is created with the methylation cycle. So this is where methylation comes in. This is why we say like, oh, you need to methylate in order to make dopamine, because with folate, you're running a wheel that's making biopterin that's helping to convert tyrosine to L-DOPA and L-DOPA to dopamine. So it's like all these moving gears. Without the folate, you're not able to methylate, you're not able to make biopterin, and then you're not able to do the steps of making dopamine. And a lot of us, when we hear a lot about methylation, like MTHFR, so methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, the enzyme that is involved in making folate, a lot of people have very slow MTHFR enzymes, just like people can have slow and fast MAO enzymes. And so these people have a really hard time making folate. And so you need to get more folate from your diet. And the problem in North America, I'll say this real quick because this is like a whole other side, but the problem in North America is that a lot of our foods are fortified, and our multivitamins and our like over-the-counter kind of run-of-the-mill B vitamins are fortified with something called folic acid, which is actually not the same chemical as folate. And somebody who is MTHFR, a slow enzyme, so they're heterozygous or homozygous for slow enzyme, or they're deficient in that enzyme, and they have reduced enzyme function, they will not be making folate out of folic acid. Okay, so, and then the folic acid may even block their ability to make folate, so it might even slow them down more. So this is where having beef liver, having leafy greens, and consuming B vitamins and multivitamins that have active folate, MTHFR, rather than folic acid is really important. And basically the folate, it like runs the hamster wheel to get all of these things moving. Really relevant for ADHD. And also very relevant for depression and anxiety. Now, we degrade dopamine through something called COMT, catechol-methyltransferase. And all of these things are SNPs. This is in the realm of like genomics. So when you get like your DNA tested, like you can take your 23andMe data and you can run it through these SNP detectors. They'll tell you like, do you have fast comp? Do you have slow comp? Do you have fast or slow MAO? Do you have, do you have a fast MTH or efficient MTHFR enzyme? And they'll look at other SNPs as well. And these are really interesting. As NDs, we can't order genetic testing, but we can interpret it. And so it's really interesting to confirm to corroborate somebody's symptoms with their genetic predispositions. And it's interesting because SNPs are something that you can influence positively. You can, eat more folate or supplement properly. It allows you to maintain your health because you know what you always kind of need, right? So when you're feeling really great, you're like, oh, it's because I'm taking an activated B vitamin. And when I stop taking activated B vitamin, I notice my mood eventually starts to slip and it returns when I start taking that B vitamin again. So this self-knowledge is really helpful, and it just helps us generate a bigger picture, a better blueprint of how to help you feel good. So we degrade dopamine through COMT, catechol-methyltransferase. This is a really, really relevant enzyme for mental health because there's a val-val, so valine and methionine. These are amino acids at codon 158 of the gene. But what you need to know is fast COMT, a fast enzyme, has val-val. So there's a substitution at one of the codons, right? It's just, it's a, I guess, a mutation, you could call it, but it's not a mutation that's going to like make you have a third arm or something. It's a mutation that's just going to make that enzyme run faster. Okay, so val-val is often called it can be called in literature the warrior type. So COMT degrades dopamine, also degrades epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it actually also processes estrogen. And so the faster you're COMT, the faster you're going to turn over dopamine. So the faster dopamine is going to leave your system. And the better you're going to feel by stuff that boosts dopamine, but also norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, so when you are the warrior type, you have a fast COMT, you process aversive stimuli really well, and therefore you feel better under stress. But you might lack, you can imagine, concentration, you might lack motivation, you might feel more like ADHD type symptoms. You might be more depressed. You might feel more empty more often. You might really crave like excitement, and you might suffer from addictions, things that are going to boost your dopamine. So you probably, want more stress. A slow COMT is the met variety. So methionine is more of the worrier type. So you have better concentration and memory and attention, but you perform worse under stress and you might suffer from anxiety. And this is because not only do you have higher dopamine levels because it's taking longer for you to degrade or get rid of dopamine, but you're also taking longer to get rid of your norepinephrine and epinephrine. So I guess what you could think of at COMT is kind of like a drain. And if you fill the sink up with dopamine, if you have a fast drain, the sink's going to empty really quick, the dopamine in your sink, your metaphoric sink. If you have a slow COMT, it's going to take a long time to clear the drain. But if you add more stress to the drain, dopamine, norepinephrine, you will likely, stress will probably motivate you to focus, and you may perform better under stress, but you're going to be way more sensitive to stress because it's harder for you to clear those fight or flight chemicals like norepinephrine, epinephrine. And it's interesting to note that estrogen slows COMT down. So we talked about how during ovulation, when estrogen peaks, it could be associated with more positive mood because it's also slowing down MAO-A. So you have more serotonin. It might increase motivation and sex drive and excitement and like the, socialization, creativity, because it's also taking longer to slow down just to clear dopamine. However, and so again, PMS could also be related to dopamine, where you have a big drop in estrogen right before your period. That could be associated with like a drop in dopamine, this feeling of like, I just want to lie down and like eat chocolate and I feel like trash. However, if you tend to have higher estrogen levels, estrogen dominance, you might be more prone to anxiety. And there's a theory that maybe this is why women are more aversive to like stressful, like high adrenaline kind of activities because you roll down a ramp on your skateboard and your body's flooded with adrenaline and it feels extremely uncomfortable because you already take longer relatively to clear this adrenaline from your system. You just might feel dysregulated more. Whereas somebody who doesn't have a lot of estrogen in their body or who isn't fluctuating estrogen and therefore has a faster COMT would probably really crave that excitement and adrenaline because it's going to keep them level. So I always look at this, like when patients tell me like, I like to race cars. I like to do like, like really high intensity stuff. That's really interesting because it could tell us about their dopamine recycling pathways. A story, my cousin was like an absolute terror as a kid. And now she's a mixed martial artist, a professional MMA fighter. And her personality has completely changed. And I think she probably has fast COMT. And she probably now has like just better focus and more level dopamine levels because she's engaging in like high stress, high intensity, high adrenaline activities regularly. And I see this like when I watch biographies with big wave surfers or people who are in like extreme sports, they'll often talk about their childhood and they're like, I was just this kid that was running around all the time. I was like, I couldn't sit still. Like you would never find me in a classroom. I'd skip school constantly. I'd get into trouble. And when you talk to them as adults and they've found this sport that they're passionate about, they're like a lot calmer and more centered. And so it's interesting because we often think like sit and meditate and that'll calm you down. But for a lot of people, it doesn't work. They have a paradoxical effect to quote calming exercises because they just need more stimulation to feel centered and calm. So low dopamine is lack of motivation, gray depression, hopelessness, meaninglessness, apathy, fatigue, poor concentration, difficulty finding words is a really interesting one, right? So we don't have the executive function to find words. We're not articulate, low sex drive, trouble sleeping, a lack of pleasure and interest in doing things. So anhedonia is another word for that. And seeking of sensory stimulation. And so this to me is depression, right? Like this is what I think of when I think of depression, just meaninglessness. Maybe low serotonin depression may be more like anxiety, more like the feeling that something's bad is going to happen. I've got to do something, like more of an OCD. And I actually find that because SSRIs, a little aside here, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they help some people and they don't help others. So in the wash, they moderately impact anxiety and depression. But I find that people who have more, like my patients with OCD, a low dose of Zoloft, it's usually Zoloft, and it's usually not even a therapeutic dose. A low dose of Zoloft just takes the edge off that like OCD circuit in their brain where they feel they have a little bit more control over the intrusive thoughts. And those are the people I've seen respond to an SSRI the best. So it's interesting to think that might be because we've like located the issue of being low serotonin. And for some reason, there's many antidepressants, many SSRIs, but Zoloft seems to be the one that helps with the OCD. But I would say probably Cipralex or citalopram is another name for it. That is probably the more common antidepressant prescribed. So another name for Zoloft is sertraline. So there's a theory that ADHD is caused by a defective DRD2 receptor. And so it's harder to respond to dopamine. It's also interesting, though, the DRD2 receptor is thought to like play a role in like determining if you're a hunter or a farmer. So there's people that feel great doing just like consistent, like regulated, like work on a schedule, like the farmer, right? You have to show up every day and you've got to work the fields and you have to do kind of the same thing every time. You have to be reliable, you have to be punctual, early riser. And then you have the hunters who are more adventurous, who want to go out and find new territory and find different foods and try different things. It's thought that people with ADHD, with the defective or maybe not defective, maybe like just the less responsive DRD2 receptors are more of this hunter subtype. And there's a theory that we need everybody in the population. And this is sort of the role for SNPs, right? They're not mutations, like they're adaptive in certain situations. And there's this diversity of our genetics that is sort of required in humans. I think the issue is when we're in a situation or in a environment that doesn't nurture this genetic diversity, we tend to suffer. So when we're in a learning environment, for example, with children, where you're expected to be more like a farmer, you're expected to like sit still in your seat, memorize things. Maybe I'm strawmanning education, but this was a lot of my elementary school education, was like memorizing worksheets, coloring, like very quiet, like focused activities, methodical activities. And for me, it was maddening. And so I would daydream. That was my response. But a more hyperactive subtype of ADHD would just like not be able to sit still and do it. And so these are kids that probably need to go outside, need to explore, need to be stimulated, need to be excited about what they're learning. And so those kids will suffer in a learning environment that doesn't sort of foster their individuality. But it doesn't mean that their brains are wrong, right? And so the more we learn about our like genetic individuality and how we respond to dopamine, the more we think like this could be adaptive. You need people in your corner, in your population, in your community that are willing to like go and explore. But you also need people in your community that are willing to show up on time and do the boring work or the work that other people find is boring. So it's cool to think that, and some people, this isn't to say that some people with ADHD suffer greatly. Their symptoms are very dysfunctional, let's say. They're having a hard time functioning. But it's interesting to think that a lot of what we consider, like how we define mental health, right, changes through the years and through time and is very environment and societally dependent. So norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is made from dopamine. So you still need the tyrosine, you still need iron, you still need biotin, you still need B6 to make it. And it is a fight or flight chemical. So this is a worrier chemical. And it's recycled through COMT, right? So the slower your COMT is, the more norepinephrine you're going to have in your system. And the more, anxious you potentially will be. But you'll also have like better focus and attention. And the less you'll want to be stressed. You're not going to necessarily perform well under stress because you already have enough stimulation. And maybe you're irritated by like excess, stimulation. So arousal, attention, cognitive function, stress, regulation of emotions, are all actions of norepinephrine. So it's not just fight or flight, but it is like anxiety, right? So like norepinephrine's released, your bronchioles dilate, your heart races, your skin opens up and you start to feel that creepy crawly feeling. You start to sweat, your pupils dilate, you focus in like kind of on your peripheral vision expands. You're not focused on fine detail, but you're very alert, right? You are very, your attention is turned to what is relevant. And you're very aroused, right? You're very motivated because it's like a tiger jumped out of the bushes. And so now you have all this norepinephrine and epinephrine in your system. Norepinephrine is more relevant for mental health. Epinephrine is, I believe it's more heart and airways. So like you get epinephrine injections when you're suffering from anaphylactic shock. And when your heart stops, you might push one of epi, right? So that gets your heart beating. Whereas norepinephrine is more, maybe I want to say peripheral. That could be wrong, but it's definitely more involved in like mental health and cognitive function. It's related to like prefrontal cortex function. And so the three neurochemicals that are most involved in antidepressant treatment are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Right? So we have SNRIs, selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. They're like Effexor or desvenlafaxine, which are more related to, like often they're prescribed for, they can be prescribed for anxiety, but they're often more prescribed for like low energy depression. Like sometimes doctors will prescribe that for first line. I see them often like prescribed second line, like Cipralex might be the first choice. And then doctor's like, okay, if that didn't work, we'll try you on Effexor. DNRI is dopamine and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So that's like let's say if like an SSRI isn't working, it tends to not be associated with like weight gain, sleep dysfunction, or sexual dysfunction. Whereas, SSRIs definitely have this like blocking of libido. And so DNRIs don't really work on serotonin at all. And I can't remember the common drug that's used. I might remember it, but it's an antidepressant that doesn't have any serotonin reuptake actions. And so by regulating by stopping the reuptake of these three chemicals, this is improving mood or relieving depression and anxiety. And norepinephrine, so you get a feel-good hit when you are exposed to norepinephrine. Like you feel euphoric, you feel elated, you feel excited, right? This is like the rush. And it's kind of like, it goes kind of hand in hand with dopamine because they're both recycled through COMT, and we make norepinephrine from dopamine. So they're kind of together, right? So in the Molecule of More, he talks about like, you're in an emergency situation and all of a sudden you're like focused, like you're just able to do what you need to do. And he's like, it's like you get this hit of norepinephrine, which alerts you and focuses you. And then you get the dopamine that like calms and allows you to think clearly and perform under intense stress. So, norepinephrine along with dopamine is involved in something called executive functioning. I did like an Instagram on this as a joke, but executive functioning is a big part of my practice because this is like what we often see. We see impaired executive functioning. Honestly, like generally I see Gen Z really suffers from this. Millennials suffer. It might be because we are like over dopamine saturated. Like we all have like dopamine addictions. Like we're hitting the dopamine button over and over and over again. But basically executive functioning is the complex organization of higher mental functions that process mental and environmental input to enable efficient problem solving. So you're taking, what your problem is, you're focusing in on the relevant information, you're metabolizing it. It's like playing 3D chess. I mean, it's like playing regular chess, but because we're living in a 3D world, we're basically always playing 3D chess. We don't even realize it, right? It's like, I need to make dinner. What do I need to do to make dinner? Well, I need to have the ingredients. I need to have the time. I need to have the recipe. I need to have the will, the muscle movements, the ability to keep it all in my brain so I can execute the movements. There's a million things going on at once. I might be washing the dishes at the same time. I might be setting the table at the same time. Like what seems like normal tasks. When you watch a baby develop, you can see how complex a lot of our everyday tasks are, right? And so executive functioning is this process of, so we inhibit irrelevant or unacceptable behavior, irrelevant information. We suppress non-pertinent information. So when I'm making a steak dinner, it doesn't matter how tight my shirt is, unless it's like, or like, what I'm wearing necessarily, unless it's like really relevant in terms of like, it's super uncomfortable and it's like restricting my ability to accomplish the task. But like, if you remember, like what color of socks did you have on yesterday when you were making dinner? You probably don't remember unless there's some other reason why which socks you had, right? You probably weren't thinking about your socks. It was relevant information. Regulation of verbal and nonverbal working memories. This is where like when you have low dopamine, low norepinephrine, there's often this like difficulty finding words, right? It's like one time I couldn't remember the word door. And it's just like your brain's just tapped out, right? It's not like this often happens kind of like 2 to 4 p.m. where like it's often a blood sugar phenomenon, to be honest. Self-regulation of affect. So I can't be having like a tantrum when I'm making dinner. I can't be like super angry. Like I have to like regulate my emotions. And so like the toddlers have really bad executive functioning. Their brains are developing, they're pruning, teenagers too. It's a learned skill, right? This is like what I think university really helped me with this, because it was just like an unholy amount of things I had to do that there was no choice but to like organize myself and like improve my executive functioning. And there's like so many tips and tricks on the internet for how to do this, right? Like setting a timer for 2 minutes, setting a timer for 20 minutes, like giving yourself a reward afterwards, writing things down. So yeah, self-regulation of affect, right? So like pushing through certain negative mood states or being able to suppress or regulate mood states. This is why we are often like tapped out at the end of the day, because we're regulating our mood a lot, right? You can't yell at this is often like why people, when we talk about irritability as a symptom of depression, irritability can often be a symptom of low executive functioning, because it takes a lot of work to suppress your irritation, to like always like be kind of managing your emotions. When things are pissing you off all day long, you're like, oh, I can't say that. I gotta put that away. And I actually had a client, like, I'm like, when something like really stressful happens at work, like emotionally draining or emotionally upsetting, as we anticipated that something like that was going to happen specific to her, I was like, let's imagine like putting it in a box and storing it for later, for when you finish work, and then you can open that box and cry or scream or whatever. And that just allows you to like, you're going to attend to it. You're going to acknowledge and feel these emotions, but you don't want to break down at work. And that takes an immense amount of executive functioning. So that'd be really, really, really hard to do with somebody who is dealing with low dopamine, low norepinephrine. And, why would you have this? Maybe you have low iron. Maybe you're B6 deficient. Maybe you need more folate. Maybe you're a fast comped person and you need more protein. You need more tyrosine. Maybe you're PMSing, right? We're irritable before our periods because we're getting this big our comps are speeding up or slowing down, sorry. And so we're, they're speeding up because our estrogen's dropping. So we're getting this like big surge of, or a big drop in our dopamine, and executive functioning could take a turn. And that's kind of like why motivation can drop right before our cycle. Motivation, arousal, planning, decision-making, self-monitoring as you approach a goal, and self-evaluation when you get to the goal, right? So you're saying like, how did I do? Was this the efficient way to do it? How would I do better next time? Et cetera, right? It's very like higher order thinking. It's like corporate. It's very like university level stuff. Like this is all like executive functioning, but it's also just completing like complex tasks, so making dinner was the example I used, organizing yourself to go to the gym, starting a new routine. That's massive. And so when we talk about executive functioning, like there is a bit of a battery life on it for the day. And that can definitely drain faster if you're not well rested, if you have these nutrient deficiencies causing neurotransmitter or neuromodulator, like abnormalities or deficiencies basically. And blood sugar is a big one. So nutrient deficiencies, which one did I say? Yeah. And then also making way too many decisions, trying to do way too many things at once can be difficult, right? So you're like trying to manage your emotions and start a new, routine that involves complex tasks, something like meal planning. It takes a big hit to our executive functioning. So the prefrontal cortex is involved in executive functioning. This is sort of like what makes us humans, right? My dog doesn't necessarily, Coco has an agenda, but he's not necessarily like doing complex tasks like making dinner, although he always impresses me. So who knows? He has a prefrontal cortex. It responds to norepinephrine and dopamine, and then to a lesser extent, serotonin and acetylcholine. The serotonin is definitely involved in like the orbital, like shutting down the orbitofrontal cortex pathway. Sort of like the parts of our brain that are like, oh, something bad happened or something bad will happen if I don't do something. The serotonin kind of calms that down. And acetylcholine is like focused and sustained attention. And we'll get to that one soon. And so we actually can boost norepinephrine with cold therapy. So that's what cold plunges do. They give you a boost of antioxidants. They improve circulation. But they also increase norepinephrine and dopamine. And there's actually studies that show that the dopamine increase you get from cold therapy can last all day long. So, and then there's also this sense of achievement because you did something hard. Doing something hard will give you a hit of dopamine. And kind of moderating your pleasure will also do that, right? So rather than like playing video games all day, just scrolling Instagram all day, dopamine, it's like moderating those behaviors. I'm going to play Instagram. I'm going to play video games like after I finish this boring task as a reward. Or or I'm going to go take an Instagram break. Yeah. After I do this boring thing, that might be better for dopamine regulation. Exercise will also raise norepinephrine. Fasting will do it. So it's stressful, and caffeine too. I think of these though, probably cold therapy is going to have the biggest hit. Like when you go in cold water, your heart's racing, you feel stressed, you want to get out, right? And then when you get out, you feel amazing. That's why people are doing it. Now, I did read an article about cold therapy that I agree with, that's saying like, if you're already really stressed, like if your nervous system is fried, this probably might not be the best thing for you, right? You can imagine you probably also shouldn't fast, do really intense exercise, or chug a bunch of caffeine if you're really fried and depleted, because your body might have a hard time mounting that kind of stress response. So I think this is always a good thing. Like, this is something I talk to my patients about. It's something I'll talk to my clients about as a psychotherapist, is like, how can we trust our motivation levels, right? There's a certain level at which it's like helpful to kind of push yourself a bit, right? Because if you're lying on the couch and you're like, I should go for a walk, but I don't really feel like it, that could mean that you shouldn't walk. But it could also mean that you're just having a hard time transitioning, which we need dopamine for, transitioning to a different activity, getting motivated enough to like, get off the couch and go for a walk. And then once you're walking, you're like feeling good. It might be a bit challenging, but you're feeling like, okay, yeah, I can do it, versus forcing yourself to get up off the couch and feeling like, I feel so dizzy and depleted and like imbalanced that I really wish I could just, like, it doesn't matter how far into the walk I am, 5 to 15 minutes. Like, I feel like I just want to go home, or I'm feeling dizzy, or need to lie down. Like, so listening to ourselves will tell us like how much should we be like trying to get an adaptive stress response from these things. So I would just say, be cautious around it. If you're not feeling good after, and 15 minutes in to these activities, or I'd say like, if you're not feeling good after, then I would back off of these norepinephrine enhancing therapies, right? Like, don't fast if you're feeling super depleted. And I see this all the time. There's a lot of intermittent fasting and people who are like really just burnt out, maybe cold therapy, explore it, but I wouldn't say like jump in for 3 minutes, no matter how you're feeling. Well, let's talk. If you have any questions about that, this is where the like individuality comes in when we're working with treatment plans and like getting people to their goals. So glutamate and GABA are interesting. Glutamate, these two are the primary neurotransmitters. We're switching gears a bit. Like, we covered the monoamines, the serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, and now we're going to talk about GABA and glutamate. They're kind of like the on-off switch in the brain. Glutamate is the on switch, and GABA is the off switch. And GABA stands for like gamma something butyric acid. And they're actually made from each other. So GABA is made from glutamate. So it's interesting. The on-off switch, it's literally an on-off switch. It's like, it just gets chemically transformed, and then it turns neurotransmitters off. So it's important to know, because I remember when I was learning neuroscience back in, like, I don't know if it was undergrad, I remember thinking glutamate on good. Like, I had this idea that like excitatory means good. If I'm tired, I probably want more glutamate because I'm going to have more brain activity. But it's interesting to note that it's not always good. We have a big brain with lots of pathways. And remember that executive functioning involves inhibiting irrelevant information or unacceptable behaviors or emotions that are too big, or self-regulation, inhibition. Oh, it's a motorcycle. And so when we are, when we're trying to get things done, like, we need to inhibit a lot. So a lot of our brain energy is involved in turning things off. And right, so we don't want to, like, if you're making dinner, you're constantly thinking about what color your socks are. Like, that's not efficient. That's not important. That's not going to help you, right? Get the task done of making your dinner. So while glutamate is great because we need it, it turns things on, it gets things running in our brain. the excitotoxicity or the excitatory nature of glutamate can cause something called excitotoxicity. Like the nerve cell gets burnt out and fried, and there's just too much information. I see people with glutamate is involved in OCD. So glutamate kind of like runs the OCD spiral, whereas serotonin shuts it and calms it down. It's like a record on repeat versus like serotonin allows you to like remove the record needle, transfer it. I don't know if this record metaphor is landing for like Gen Z, if any of you are like in your 20s, but you take there's a thing called record, there's a needle on it, would play a track and you could move it to a different spot in the track. And OCD is sort of just loop running like a hamster wheel, right? So turning it off is it actually involves a lot of energy. When we have a lot of glutamate in our brains, it can cause damage to nerves. And this is thought to be one of the pathways in dementia. So glutamate, though, is still relevant because we need it to make glutathione. We'll get into in the next slide with another amino acid called cysteine and also glycine. They make something called glutathione, which is an antioxidant in the brain, which is really important for antidepressant effects and cognitive effects. And then, like I said, glutamate's associated with OCD, so it can be excitatory. It's like sensory overload. One of my friends who dealt with sort of like OCD symptoms told me that he could feel it was like white noise in his brain, like mental fuzz. The like mice running across the brain, we call it the brain zaps, might be a glutamate phenomenon. It often occurs when people are weaning off of SSRIs, particularly SNRIs, like Effexor. You get the brain zaps, you feel like kind of electrical activity occurring that's not really necessary. So we'll talk about glutamate more in the next slide, but GABA is our inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's calming. It's anti-anxiety, anti-panic, anti-stress. It is produced in the pancreas. So it actually has a role to play in diabetes too. And it's very, very calming, supports sleep, reduces fear. So our GABA receptors are activated by benzodiazepines. So things like Ambien or the PAMs like clonazepam, diazepam, lorazepam, like those drugs, they activate GABA receptors. So they like chill you out. They have an intensely calming effect. They can put you to sleep. Alcohol also activates GABA receptors, barbiturates, these like old school drugs. These are all highly addictive because when you start hitting GABA receptors, well, these compounds like latch onto GABA receptors. And so our body kind of downgrades our own GABA production, and it actually makes less GABA receptors. So when you stop benzodiazepines, you end up with a lot of excitotoxicity. And so this is why people are at risk for like seizures. They're at risk for like heart issues, and they feel usually extremely anxious and horrible. So you have to exercise care around anything that really activates GABA directly in the brain. We need B6 to make GABA. And I use GABA supplementation actually quite a bit in my practice for panic and anxiety. I use it for like acute treatment of panic and anxiety. Now it's interesting that GABA supplements don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so it's thought like, well, they don't work because you need to get GABA into your brain to get the calming effect. Well, yes, you do to get the kind of like intent, but that will exercise sort of like a benzodiazepine effect if GABA crossed the blood-brain barrier. So what GABA supplementation is thought to do is activate the vagus nerve in the gut, which is a parasympathetic nerve, which puts us in the rest and digest or safe and social state. And when we take GABA, by stimulating the vagus nerve, we get this overall calming effect because the vagus travels to the brain. 80% of it is afferent, meaning it goes to the brain, and it has this calming effect. So it's not this like really intense calming effect you'd get from like clonazepam, but it has like a general chilling effect. And so I use it quite a bit. I wouldn't say I tell people to take it every day. Like I'll tell people to take it every day to handle acute anxiety. It's like getting the spikes down, getting the really intense like anxiety attacks and like general anxiety down while we work on the foundation. And we'll talk more about that actually too. You can chew it, and I find it takes about 30 minutes to work. And some people really respond to it. They're like, it almost makes them too chill. So back on the topic of glutamate, we have N-acetylcysteine. It's not a neurotransmitter. It's actually an amino acid. So cysteine is the amino acid, and acetylcysteine is the form of cysteine that actually can cross the blood-brain barrier. And why I'm talking about it is because it's an amino acid that I prescribe a lot. It's my favorite amino acid for prescribing. So in that amino acid video, we talked about 5-HTP, we talked about tyrosine, we talked about GABA, and we talked about them in the supplementation form. So you can prescribe 5-HTP and you can get a serotonin effect, and it's amazing. I recommend it sometimes for sleep maintenance. I recommend it for PMS, for especially the really intense carb craving PMS, for weaning off of antidepressants. 5-HTP is fantastic. Tyrosine, I recommend it less now, but it gives you about a 30-minute dopamine boost, so that could be really helpful at the beginning of someone's day, or if they're really low dopamine, just to feel more motivated. And tyrosine is also the backbone of our thyroid hormone. So there's relevance there. So it will sometimes be it'll often be in like stress supplements, like adaptogenic supplements for people who are like burnt out. But I prescribe a lot of NAC. It's probably my favorite amino acid to prescribe. And so NAC is a glutathione precursor with glutamate and GABA and glycine, which is found in bone broth, and collagen. It makes glutathione, and glutathione is the primary antioxidant in our bodies. So you can think of we have tons of mitochondria, which are these energy centers in our brain, and they're making energy for us. They're using the energy of oxygen to make ATP, which is the energy currency. Energy is your brain function, your digestive function, the health of your skin, because it's like skin turnover, cell division, hair growth. Like energy is everything. Like we're energy, right? Like this is how our body gets things done. There's tons of stuff happening all the time, and it's using ATP. It's like the economy, right? So it's like anything you see, you're like, okay, that house, money was involved. That plant somebody bought, money was involved. Like, someone's driving a car, someone's riding a bike, money, right? So 5-ATP is doing all of these things in our body, and it's using oxygen. So our body takes glucose and oxygen and makes ATP. And the oxygen is very, very reactive, and it needs to be well controlled in our body. And so when we're using oxygen for energy, we get these reactive oxygen species, we get reactive nitrogen species, we get these reactive compounds that if they're not taken care of, they can cause damage in our body. And this is called oxidative stress. Okay. And so antioxidants soak up, neutralize the reactive oxygen and make it inactive so it can't do damage. And you can eat antioxidants. You can get antioxidants from food, right? So you can, like, green tea has antioxidants and blueberries have antioxidants, but they're not as strong as our body's natural antioxidant glutathione that gets made every day in our cells. And our mitochondria, the health of our mitochondria, so their ability to make energy, relies a lot on our ability to neutralize the free radicals we make, the oxidative stress, with our own antioxidants. If you're not good at making antioxidants, then you're probably going to have a backload. You're going to have this oxidative stress build up in your cell. And if that doesn't kill your cell, it's at least going to stop energy production. So you could think of like running your car in a garage with the windows closed. Like there's going to be exhaust buildup that needs to be cleared, needs to be detoxified. So glutathione is that for us. And it's been used in medicine. NAC makes glutathione. So it contributes to an increase in glutathione levels. And it's used in conventional medicine for Tylenol overdose. So you might not know this, but 4 grams of Tylenol is a toxic dose, liver toxic, and can cause liver failure. So people in the hospital, and because one of the things that Tylenol does is depletes glutathione. And so people get NAC, intravenous NAC, if they present with Tylenol overdose that can replenish the glutathione in their bodies. NAC is also mucolytics. That means it like decreases mucus. And so it's been used medicinally for HIV, congestive heart failure, but COPD and nephropathy and Alzheimer's. So a variety of different conditions. Because nephropathy a lot of the time is glutathione deficiency. Like it's, the nerve cells are damaged. There's excitotoxicity. So yeah, glutathione's primary antioxidant in the body, created through glutamate, cysteine, glycine, and you get glycine from collagen and bone broth. It is not an essential amino acid, but we probably need more. We are designed to get some from diet, and it is not highly available in plant foods. So it's like collagen, bones are rich in glycine. So people always ask me about collagen, and I say, go for it. Couple of scoops of collagen in your smoothie or your yogurt or your oats. It gives you a bit of protein, and you get a good dose of glycine, and you get some collagen protein to replenish your joints and your skin and your hair and everything. So no downsides, or you can eat like old school marshmallows. Now marshmallows have corn syrup, but they used to have gelatin. Gelatin is another name for basically it's collagen. It is collagen, and it's rich in glycine. So that FYI. So oral glutathione is not really bioavailable. It just gets absorbed into the tissues and broken down in the stomach. You can do like liposomal, which is like under the tongue. So it'll get absorbed in the bloodstream, like through the blood vessels under your tongue. You can also do patches. You can do intravenous. You can do injections. But again, it's not as bioavailable. And cysteine as an amino acid doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, but oral NAC, so NAC supplements can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it can raise plasma glutathione levels. So it does get converted into glutathione. And so this NAC as an antioxidant, so NAC has two roles, which is really cool. One is that it makes glutathione. So it's an antioxidant. We'll talk about that. And the other thing it does is, in order to make antioxidants, it needs glutamate. So if you have too much glutamate, if you are excitotoxic, like my friend with the brain fuzz, the white noise in his brain, NAC can chill that out. It can soak up this glutamate that's creating excitotoxicity. And so I use it a lot for OCD. And we'll talk more about this. So NAC is anti-inflammatory, right? Because of its antioxidant effects. It reduces the inflammatory cytokines IL-6 and TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta. Cytokines are these immune chemicals that create inflammation. These are the three really inflammatory cytokines. They produce fever, they produce heat, and they produce like a bit of inflammation in your brain, which you can't feel because you don't have brain like pain receptors, but they're highly associated with depression. And so anything that lowers inflammation in the brain, particularly these inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, TNF-alpha, and IL-1 beta, has an anti-inflammatory effect and can help with mood. This is a big reason why the fish oil EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, is often prescribed for depression, why things like saffron, turmeric, anti-inflammatory diets, cold therapy, heat therapy, like anything anti-inflammatory. So kind of like anything good for you is anti-inflammatory. All that stuff can help with depression, and so can NAC because it's anti-inflammatory, but it's not alone in its ability to be anti-inflammatory. It also reduces lipopolysaccharide. This is a neurotoxin that is produced by gram-negative bacteria. So like dysbiosis, bad bacteria in your gut that gets absorbed into your system and can increase inflammation. And so NAC actually reduces this. It also busts biofilm. So if you have like an overgrowth of bacteria yeast in your gut, sometimes that bacteria yeast can hide from the immune system by this biofilm layer. So NAC can open that up. So it's mucolytic properties. It breaks down mucus, excess mucus in the body, including biofilm. And so it can allow our bodies to kill bacterial overgrowth or fungal overgrowth. And it's really, really important for like lung health, smoking cessation. And then, it mops up glutamate. So it can reduce cytotoxicity. It also has an insulin sensitizing effect. I use it in in PCOS. I use it in endometriosis, and sometimes in insulin resistance, like diabetes, definitely for liver conditions, because it has such an antioxidant effect. So I use it for like liver health. It's wonderful. I love it. I take it every day. And so because it's reducing excitotoxicity, it can help with addiction, because it can regulate glutamate and also regulate dopamine. It can help with OCD, which is associated with like high glutamate, or at least pathways in the brain that are overactive that are stimulated by glutamate. Trichotillomania, so grooming disorders, trichotillomania, dermatillomania, nail biting, so hair pulling, skin picking, nail biting, binge eating. These can be improved with NAC because they're associated with glutamate issues. Schizophrenia. So there's a study that showed that NAC in supplementation in schizophrenia improved insight, self-care, social interaction, motivation, volition, psychomotor stability, stabilization of mood, and so it reduced all of these symptoms. And then it's great for bipolar disorder. It reduces the depression and the mania of bipolar disorder, which is thought to be an issue with the mitochondria in the brain to some extent. So really, like any disorder related to inflammation, excitotoxicity, oxidative stress, and glutamate metabolism can be influenced by NAC. And because mitochondrial dysfunction, or like issues with the mitochondria, are so prevalent, and we have the tissues that have the most mitochondria are brain cells, liver, heart, and muscle. So when, you can think like NAC, it can be good for the heart, but the heart is a muscle, right? So there's a lot of like mitochondria and heart muscle cells, but liver issues, brain issues, NAC is great for that. And the dose is between 600 to 3,000 milligrams a day. So I usually dose it in grams, couple grams a day, but it depends on the person. And the downside is it can, because it's mucolytic, we have mucus in the body that needs to be there, like our stomach lining. So it can, if someone is susceptible to gastric ulcers or has a thin stomach lining, we have to have caution there. All right. So acetylcholine is the last neurotransmitter we're going to talk about. And it's one of my favorites. So acetylcholine is involved in muscle movements, memory, attention, and it promotes REM sleep. And it uses the building block choline, which is kind of like in the B vitamin family, I guess. Choline makes phosphatidylcholine, which we'll talk about, and that gets made into acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine works on nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors are what nicotine stimulates. So for anyone who smokes cigarettes or has, there's like bowel movements, there's focus, there's attention, there's de-stressing, a calming effect. There's like a wakefulness effect, right? So all of these things that nicotine does. You can also feel kind of nauseous. You might get diarrhea. This is acetylcholine. And it's involved in synaptic plasticity. So learning new things. So like this, there's our brain cells are always remodeling and making new connections. And this is a big thing. Like we talked about the active coping with the 5-HT2A receptors that serotonin acts on, or the psychedelics. That receptor is involved in neuroplasticity. And so acetylcholine is really like, it's like trying to find the best way to get things done, right? As we learn, we're trying to figure out, okay, like, we'll go back to the making dinner analogy. Like I've made dinner 10 times, in a row. Now I know the most efficient way to make it. My brain, my synapses have remodeled, and part of that has to do with acetylcholine. And lack of acetylcholine is one of the big hypotheses in dementia research. And so they do like acetylcholinesterase inhibitors was one of the pioneering drugs. They didn't pan out, or they kind of just like maintain prevent further decline, but they don't like heal anything. But definitely acetylcholine has a role to play in like, memory, mood regulation, attention. And it's one of the big ones for that. I think of it as kind of like the artist or the flow state. And we're going to get into the personalities of the neurotransmitters in the next slide. But I think of it as like, the flow state, kind of like you're painting, you're reading, you're really attentive, you're making music. Like that's acetylcholine. It has like a bit of a flow, right? So I have here like dreaming. I have like books and like gears and like kind of meditation. It's like this, dopamine has this, but dopamine is more like drive and exciting. This is like my brain is like watery. So it increases gastric motility. So there's a role to play in gut motility, peristalsis. So constipation, it's really relevant for people with constipation. Health of the mucous membranes. So if you are, have like inflammation in the mucous membranes, acetylcholine plays a role there. It reduces inflammation so much so that there's something called the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway that acetylcholine activates. So it inhibits the inflammatory cytokines we learned about, IL-6, TNF-alpha, and IL-1 beta that are involved in depression. And it reduces inflammation in the gut mucosa. So this is like another gut-brain connection where if there's inflammation in your gut, it's going to irritate your vagus nerve, and that's going to send danger signals to your brain. That's one way that the gut-brain issues can cause depression. Another is through lipopolysaccharides, right? So gut bacteria, gram-negative gut bacteria are making toxins that are getting into your bloodstream, getting into your brain, causing inflammation. Another is like your gut is inflamed, and so that's increasing whole body inflammation, making you sensitive to foods, making your gut irritated, and that is just increasing overall inflammation in your body. So you might be depressed and anxious, you might have joint issues, you might have fatigue, there might be a whole bunch of different symptoms, skin issues, like autoimmune issues if you're dealing with like really severe inflammation. So acetylcholine is anti-inflammatory. It sustains attention and alertness. So sustained attention and improved memory. So feeling like your brain is just like, it's not brain on like dopamine. It's just like, I feel just calmly focused and alert. And it's maybe like meditative, sleep-wake cycle. So it's involved in wakefulness. And there's other wakefulness chemicals. Orexin is one. Histamine, we won't talk about, but it's also cool. Dopamine, norepinephrine are involved in wakefulness as well. But then acetylcholine also plays a role in REM sleep. And that's when our memories are consolidated, right? So this is where we're like chewing. It's like very, like, think of it like in Chinese medicine, we call this the spleen, right? It's like digestion, processing, like chewing on your thoughts, chewing and digesting your food, moving things through the body. It has like a methodical kind of like, information processing effect. So, in depression or especially specifically trauma, there's a theory that memories are not consolidated properly because certain events that occurred are so traumatic that our brain kind of stores them separate, and then they live on their own and they kind of trigger us. Like you hear a firecracker and you think it's a gunshot, let's say, just for an example. So by like kind of allowing the memory to integrate fully, it can help to remove that separateness and allow us to like control or recall it when we want to and not just be kind of owned by it. And so memory reconsolidation is one of the pathways of EMDR, where you're like processing memories, and REM sleep can help with this memory processing. And often in depression, there may be REM sleep abnormalities. People don't dream, or you might have nightmares, right? You're trying to process and consolidate these memories. But REM sleep is like our dreaming, acetylcholine daydreaming, thinking deeply about things, the deep thinker, the philosopher. It activates the vagus nerve, so it has a parasympathetic, anti-inflammatory, anti-anxiety effect. It also is highly connected to the hypothalamus, which is like a hormone center, memory center of our brain. So it can stimulate prolactin for breastfeeding, growth hormone for muscle building, mood, weight loss, like brain development, and other hormones. And I want to talk, because this is a naturopathic lecture, about choline. So acetylcholine is made from choline, which we get from food. Okay, it's kind of in the B vitamin family. And choline is found in beef liver. That's the main source of choline. Also in egg yolks and in red meat, beef, like ground beef, hamburger, and also to a lesser extent, cruciferous veggies. So those are like the Brussels sprouts, the broccoli, cauliflower. But beef liver is your main source. Beef liver and egg yolks, far and beyond. And so higher dietary choline is associated with better cognitive performance. And so choline gets made to phosphatidylcholine, which we need for cell membranes, liver function, and gallbladder function. And it's interesting to note that if you you can create non-alcoholic fatty liver disease by depriving somebody of choline. So people who are so if you don't put choline in rats' food, they all get fatty liver. If you don't put choline in a feeding tube, so people who are getting parental nutrition, so they're getting like feeding tube nutrition, because of, brain injury or whatever, if you don't put choline in their food supply, they will all develop fatty liver. So phosphatidylcholine, or telling people that beef liver, are things that I'll recommend for fatty liver. And there's this fatty liver anxiety connection that is very common. It can sometimes be associated with hypothyroidism. And I often see it connected to insulin resistance. In a lot of insulin resistance cases, there's a fatty liver, or like insulin resistance might be the first place that we experience, fatty liver might be the first tipping point for insulin resistance, or and vice versa. Like they're very intimately connected. So with insulin resistance, we're really looking at like making sure the liver can process fat properly, because our liver ultimately is what's keeping our blood sugar steady between meals through something called gluconeogenesis. And it's keeping our blood sugar steady while we're sleeping. So if you're having irritable sleep, or like you're waking up, or you're having difficulty staying asleep, it could be an issue with gluconeogenesis. It could be blood sugar drops in the middle of the night, triggering cortisol release. And so, there is this, like in Chinese medicine, even there's a liver gallbladder connection to waking up from 1 to 3 a.m. So I take phosphatidylcholine. It's another one of my favorite supplements. I find it helps my digestion. It helps my focus, concentration. It's not super popular. Like when I worked in a free clinic, when I was an intern as an ND, there was like random bags of phosphatidylcholine, like lecithin granules, and I didn't know what it was for. And it was for, when I read more about it, it was for like regulating cholesterol levels, reducing gallstones, because phosphatidylcholine thins bile, so it allows us to digest fats. It can help to, like, over time, remove thin gallbladder sludge, right? Kind of like liquefy it. It has a huge role to play in brain development, especially for pregnant women. It's very important to take in pregnancy. Make sure you're getting enough choline, and it's involved. It's a phospholipid. Phosphatidylcholine is, so it helps with cell membranes. So our nerves have like a fatty coating on them, like a waxy kind of fatty coating that's really relevant for cognitive function, and for reducing anxiety, and for like executive functioning. And then, so phosphatidylcholine is important for brain health through the cell membrane function, but it's also highly important because it makes acetylcholine eventually. So you can take CDP choline, which is more like passes the blood-brain barrier and can be made into acetylcholine. But I like phosphatidylcholine because it's cheap. It has a lot of relevant uses, like a lot of relevant actions on the liver, gallbladder, and cell membranes, digestive function, and then you get all the benefits of acetylcholine. So most people are like, what the heck is that? Like, I'm taking that long word thing you prescribed, and I'm like, so now hopefully you know what it's for. Although I try to explain, but we don't always remember. It's a lot. And this is a long lecture. So you can always come back to this. If you're listening to the podcast, feel free to go check out the YouTube video, because there's visuals and there's actually notes. So there's something, when I was in naturopathic college, there's something called the Braverman questionnaire. I'm just looking at my spelling now. It's horrific. There's 2 T's in questionnaire. Braverman questionnaire is this, like, it's a quiz that tells you what personality type you are according to the neurotransmitters dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, and GABA. So that's and norepinephrine, I believe. I don't think norepinephrine's in it. It's dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and GABA. So it tells you, like, you answer true, false to a series of questions. And it tells you, like, what you're high in, like what your kind of personality is, and what you could be low in. And it's super interesting. It's not super validated. I mean, I saw a study that said, like, your type could determine what exercise is best for you, which, you know, but I also see, like, kind of a parallel with the 4 humors, you know, the, like, choleric, phlegmatic, with the 4 elements, and even with Ayurvedic dosha types. So I kind of drew a parallel here. I'm going to describe the 4 types because I think it's just interesting, and it's kind of a fun way to understand neurotransmitters, like what the neurotransmitter, like, personality is. I don't know. I guess, what is this? This is like a synesthesia kind of thing. Maybe it's because I'm a serotonin acetylcholine personality, but I think it's really interesting. So I thought I'd share it. And you can download the Braverman from the internet. It's really long. You can go through it and you can get your types if you're interested. You just Google Braverman questionnaire and there's a PDF. And here's, like, the first page, right? So for dopamine, it's like, true or false, I find it easy to process my thoughts. I concentrate effectively. I'm a deep thinker. I'm a quick thinker. I have a lot of energy most of the time. Some individuals view me as tough-minded. Most people view me as achievement-oriented. So you can kind of get an idea what dopamine stands for. So very cool, very interesting. So let's explore the types. So the serotonin nature is in the moment, a realist, responsive to sensory input, impulsive, has a love of the game, love of the journey, likes to try new things, adventurous, mind-body connection, physically coordinated, hand-eye coordination. So this is like the surfer, the skateboarder, the dancer, freedom, cheerful, optimistic, easygoing, fun, broad, array of friends, disdain for order and routine, loves independence, relishes alone time, highs during dangerous activities, free-spirited. And so I have, like, hippie imagery. I just think of, like, the hippie who's, like, California surfer, like, has one of these hippie buses, camping outdoors, like, peace, love, you know, which is very serotonin. It's like, you know, LSD, psilocybin, 5-HT2A receptors kind of fits, right? You know, it's like, I like the way things are, but I kind of like adventure. And I think serotonin nature, according to the Braverman questionnaire, I think it kind of fits with, like, a vata, like, air type, and sanguinous. It's kind of like the sanguinous subtype of the, is it the 4 humors, like phlegmatic, sanguinous, melancholic, choleric? And my best friend who lives in Bali is this 1,000,000%. She's like comedy, improv, very airy, can't live in the same place for more than 3 years. So dopamine nature is strong-willed, fast, self-confident, rational, high-focus, driven, high achiever, strategic, problem solver. Probably does better with, like, more weightlifting, like power activities, chess, so strategy, like, functions really well under stress. And this is kind of fits with a lot of what we learned about dopamine, right? Like the warrior type. And this is, like, I thought was, like, related to, like, choleric, and is more pitta in the Ayurvedic dosha system, and is more like fire type. So I have, like, a bullseye, strong arm. The GABA nature is stable, consistent, social, concerned for others, dependable, calm in chaos, punctual, practical, objective, organized, level-headed, and emotionally measured and stable. Probably gravitates more to traditions, institutions, family, nurturing. I have, like, a Mother Gaia and a clock for imagery. And I think this is, like, the melancholic archetype, kapha and earth. Yeah, and it's kind of like the farmer, right? We learned about like farmer hunters. So it's definitely not an ADHD person, but there's like kind of a chilled out, dependable, steady, not a lot of ups and downs. Probably has like high executive functioning, objective, organized. And then finally, the acetylcholine nature. So I think this is me. So this is the sensory world, creative, quick thinker, sensitive, considerate, devoted, flexible, spontaneous, intuitive, innovative, into communication, ideas, words, the writer, the artist, the counselor, the love, adventure, the altruistic. So it's like the philosopher, the artist, the counselor, the therapist. This is the naturopathic doctor. I think this is the phlegmatic type, and it's like kind of like kapha, water kapha, maybe a bit of vata, because it's like ideas, communication, and water. And I'm a water Pisces all the way. So yeah, do the Braverman. It's very interesting. I think it's pretty cool. So finally, this is the last slide. This is where we're talking about like, how do we support neurotransmitters? So in that video, right, the amino acids for mental health, I talk a lot about amino acids, right? This is what 5-HTP is good for. This is what GABA is good for. And I do use amino acids in my practice quite a bit. Like I said, I use NAC a lot. I recommend phosphatidylcholine a lot, but I practice very differently nowadays. Like I have a bit more of a grounded process to how I practice. There's a bit of an underlying philosophy. So whereas maybe I was a bit, I don't know how to say it before, it's just come with time, I guess. It's been 10 years almost since I got my license. So I think of things on a hierarchy. This is not new. There's something called the therapeutic order, but mine's a little bit simpler. And so, you can imagine a triangle if you're not looking at this slide. And, we have at the bottom the foundation of the triangle is lifestyle. This is like what your body just needs to function, right? The non-negotiables, like you need real food with actual nutrition, right? So you need to have a diet that has tryptophan, iron, B6, choline. Like you just need food that contains these things. And we were meant to get them from food, not supplements. You need water, you need sunlight, you need daily movement, you need sleep, you need purpose, connection, fresh air, fun, safety, all of that stuff. So this is the first thing I try to do with people is like, okay, are you getting enough protein? Because most people are not. And these amino acids are protein, right? So if you're not eating enough protein, are you getting enough amino acids? And a lot of people are deficient, especially, and I'm sorry, vegans, but there are not a lot of vegan foods that are high in tryptophan, and it's an essential amino acid. So when I'm working with vegans, and I respect, I don't change anyone's diet. But there's just facts on the ground. So with vegans, I will say like pumpkin seeds 100% are if you're depressed or anxious and you're vegan, we need to get you eating pumpkin seeds. You can get enough tryptophan. And I think protein powder is a non-negotiable for vegans, a scoop a day, let's say, so that you can have complete amino acids. You can get tryptophan. And, a lot of like Vega is a good brand. Like there's a lot of really good tasting vegan protein powders out there, but it's just really difficult to get the protein you need and the tryptophan and the tyrosine and glycine and choline if you're a vegan, right? So we're talking about, maybe vegans, we have to do phosphatidylcholine because you can't do egg yolks and you can't do beef liver. So we're looking at like foods, right? So getting the actual foods, like making sure, so I might recommend beef liver. I recommend that a lot as a supplement because it has iron, it has copper, it has vitamin A, it has choline, it has B12, it has folate. There's all these things for making neurotransmitters. Egg yolks. So people like tell me they do the egg whites. I'm hearing less and less of that, but like the yolk is the multivitamin. Poultry for your tryptophan, red meat for choline and iron and protein, and cruciferous veggies. Cruciferous veggies have choline and they have folate. Um, whole grains for vitamin B6 could be something. Sunshine. So I'm telling people, get outside, get outside. Hot and cold therapy, being in the elements. People are like, oh, I don't really go outside in the winter. Well, you're getting cold therapy if you go outside. I don't really go outside in the summer. It's too hot. You're getting sun if you go outside. Like, go outside in the elements. This is how our neurotransmitters are regulated, right? We learned we can regulate dopamine and norepinephrine through cold. We can regulate serotonin through heat. So it's actually good to feel a bit uncomfortable. You don't have to like jump in a cold bath, but being cold could boost your dopamine. Movement, super essential, right? How many of these neurotransmitters are involved in movement? Serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, dopamine, outdoor time, nature time, like putting ourselves in these, like if you notice a lot of the pictures, right? It was like people lying on the grass, people hugging, like we need all these things because these are what the neurotransmitters do. So we probably need to put ourselves in a situation where the neurotransmitters are activated, right? Our brains are a negotiation between us and the environment, right? They're trying to help us adapt to our environment. So if there's no scenario in which we need dopamine, if we're getting these dopamine hits over and over again by like those rats who are pressing a cocaine lever or a lever that just stimulates dopamine centers in their brain, we're not motivated to go out and do things, to make the connections, to engage in the hobbies, to try the challenging things. And our executive function will take a hit, and our mood can take a hit. And there's a psychiatrist, Anna Lambke, that talks about these dopamine fasts, where she says, like, don't do whatever your like toxic, like whether it's like gaming or whatever, don't do it for 30 days. And what that does is resets our dopamine receptors so that we can get pleasure from just engaging in like making a podcast. How long did it take me to do this? It took me forever. I had to like really do all of my executive functioning tasks to get this done. Purpose, reward, social life. Again, it's like, these are all very dopamine things. Circadian rhythms is super important, right? Because REM sleep and acetylcholine and serotonin helps with sleep, and GABA is involved with sleep. And we tend to get more cortisol in the morning when we're like, that's our wake cycle. So our circadian rhythms are super important. And sunlight is our circadian, like it sets our circadian clocks, as does movement and as does food. So the second rung on the hierarchy, and I realized that the pyramid's one way and the words are another. So the second pyramid is like, sometimes lifestyle, we've had imbalances for too long, right? Like if we're iron deficient, and we're not always deficient because we didn't get enough from our diet. Sometimes we're iron deficient because we use too much of it, because we don't have the cofactors to help it metabolize. Like we don't have the copper, we don't have the vitamin A to help it get processed properly. We are bleeding, right? Heavy periods. We're not absorbing it. Although that is, I find, less of an issue, but it is one. So sometimes we have deficiencies and we need to replenish deficiencies, right? And often when my patients are coming in to see me, they're kind of past the stage of lifestyle where lifestyle can have an effect in a timely manner to get them feeling better. Like I am motivated to get you feeling better as quickly as possible. And it takes a lot of work. And when you don't have optimal executive functioning, optimal mood and motivation, it's really hard to establish like the sunshine, the circadian rhythms, the right food, the right diet, the meal planning. Like, so it's kind of like you're trying to repair a car while it's running. And I think that's where supplementation is pretty much in everyone's treatment plan, because most people are coming in because something's wrong. Like they have symptoms, right? They don't feel good. They're motivated to come in, pay me money, and spend time to see me because they're not feeling good. So we often will add supplementation in. And supplementation, because it's restoring deficiencies, could be removing excesses and possibly managing imbalances. Supplementation comes in to treat this. And so supplements that restore deficiencies are a big part of my practice, right? So this is like iron. Now I'm doing more like beef liver, to be honest, but which is kind of like lifestyle, but it's still a supplement. I'm doing zinc, magnesium, massive one in my practice, making sure vitamin D is involved, B vitamins, and then and choline, like phosphatidylcholine, that's where that comes in. Could be where NAC comes in. if it's like, we need to like support your liver, we need to reduce toxicity, we need to reduce inflammation, stress. So this might be more behavioral stuff. Like, okay, we need to start getting your stress down. And so this is why we're doing those, right? We're thinking, okay, we got to restore your iron deficiency with like more focused supplementation, and maybe then you can just maintain your iron levels with just eating more red meat, And so often, like when it comes to choline, like we might say take beef liver, but I might say let's take phosphatidylcholine, get your choline levels up, or maybe you just need more. And there's often a biochemical individuality here, right? Like if you have a really fast compt, we might put things in there that can slow it down. If folate might be something you always have to take if you have MTHFR deficiency, and so on. And then finally, imbalances. So there can be imbalances in our biochemical pathways and our hormonal pathways. So I think of like, if we are burnt out, so we're not making enough cortisol, we can't turn off our norepinephrine and epinephrine signaling. So we're like very anxious often. Our circadian rhythms are out of whack. And like oftentimes, circadian rhythms, right, is lifestyle. It's like the bottom rung of the ladder of the pyramid. And then, if your circadian rhythm's out of whack, we might say, okay, like magnesium, so you can help you sleep and that kind of thing. But when our circadian rhythm's really out of whack, our whole cortisol cycle can get out of whack. And the imbalance can perpetuate itself like a snake eating its own tail, like a vicious cycle, right? So if you're not making cortisol in the morning, you might be making it at night. That's preventing you from sleeping. That's throwing your circadian rhythm off. So you're tired in the morning. So it's hard to get up. So you can see what I mean? Iron deficiency. Iron deficiency can lead to heavy periods, which is wild. It's because heavy periods cause more iron deficiency. So oftentimes, in order to like break that cycle, we have to do a bit more of, let's say, aggressive, because nothing's really aggressive in natural medicine, but more aggressive treatment. So there we might be doing higher doses of supplements. We might be doing amino acids at that point, right? So amino acids, because someone has an addiction, weaning, there's an imbalance that we're doing. And so I do a lot of herbs at this stage. So adaptogenic herbs are big, anti-anxiety herbs. This is more temporary, right? This is more where we're getting in and out for maybe months to a year, getting people feeling better, and then we're backing off. We're treating dysbiosis. We're really like managing organs, symptoms, hormonal pathways. Maybe we're working with estrogen because we're noticing estrogen is like on a roller coaster and that's throwing off your serotonin and dopamine when it crashes before your period. So, and this might be also where we're supporting mitochondrial health because we're like, okay, like your mitochondria are backed up. So I like to think of it this way, whereas my other video was about amino acids and how great they are. And I think what spurred me into making this entire lecture was that because people were writing to me being like, oh, I take zinc, or I take GABA, or I take tryptophan, and like it's helped me so much. And that's fantastic, and I wouldn't say for them to stop or anything like that. I'm not saying that. What I'm interested in is like, I mean, as a naturopathic doctor, I'm interested in getting to the root cause, right? So you probably don't have just a straight up GABA deficiency, but GABA is a wonderful tool to reduce anxiety, to manage addiction, to help you sleep, to manage panic while we do the heavy lifting below the surface, restoring deficiencies, removing excesses. Like, do you have fatty liver? Is that why you have anxiety and panic? Do you have intense stress? Are you protein deficient? So you can't even make serotonin because you have no tryptophan? Do you not have any iron? Do you have like no purpose? And that's making you anxious, right? So we're like, it's kind of like that active versus passive coping. Like we're also addressing the root of the issue. And so GABA is fantastic. 5-HTP, I use a lot, but I wouldn't say that I have people on that for very long. And the reason is because when we're doing treatment to restore imbalances for long periods of time, we run the risk, in my opinion, of causing further imbalances if we go too far. So this is why, like, having a guide to walk you through, like, okay, seeing the bigger picture, understanding the neurotransmitters, understanding the other hormones that are at play that we didn't even talk about, the other neurotransmitters like histamine that we didn't even talk about, and how that fits in with your nutrition, with your lifestyle, with the supplements that might be helpful, with like the context that you find yourself in, right? That might be where therapy comes in. Looking at blood work, like all of these things can be really helpful. And then having someone design a plan for you based on this information, right? How does depression even manifest in your life? Like what are the symptoms? Is it more like a serotonin or dopamine thing? Or is it even like sometimes with depression, we don't even deal with the neurotransmitters. We deal with the hormonal pathways, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, thyroid, the sex hormones, estrogen. So sometimes we're not even dealing with neurotransmitters when we're talking about depression. And sometimes we are dealing more with nutrition, right? Because it's like, we don't need to worry if it's serotonin or dopamine. If you're iron deficient, it's going to be both of those things. And you're going to be tired and you're not going to be making energy properly. So your brain's not going to be functioning as well as it could. So it goes beyond neurotransmitters. So what I'm looking at, is like, what's the strategy? What are we going to try first? How are we going to assess this? And then once you're feeling better, how are we going to maintain that? And often it's like peeling the layers and sticking with like more of a lifestyle-based routine, right? And so people's plans get very simple. That's something I was doing throughout the summer, was putting people on maintenance plans, which was amazing. It was like, okay, like we've got you on like 3 supplements, 1 key lifestyle practice to really focus on, and I'll see you in 6 months or a year. Or if anything changes. And that's like great because people feel better, and they wouldn't have felt better because they weren't feeling better because they'd been dealing with these symptoms for such a long time, whether it was constipation or depression or horrible allergies. So super rewarding. So I just wanted to offer this slide, this last one of the healing hierarchy, this idea of lifestyle deficiencies, excesses, and imbalances as like to help you understand the concept of like why there's so many things that you could prescribe, right? You look on the internet, like, how do I help my dopamine? There's just like a billion things. There's rhodiola, there's what's it called? Mucuna purines. Like there's all these things. But the interesting thing is that those things are very short-lived. Tyrosine, they're short-lived, right? Because dopamine is a complex system that's involved in it's a neuromodulator. It's modulating our response, our interaction with our environment, with other people. And you can't just like chemically hijack that without consequences. And so what we're looking at is like, why is dopamine out of balance? Like, is it a genetic thing? And therefore you need specific practices or maybe supplements to help you thrive and thrive in this environment that we can't always change? Or is it, nutrient deficiencies? Like, what is it that's causing this low dopamine and contributing to these symptoms that you're experiencing? And we haven't even gotten to inflammation because that's like a whole other can of worms, but that has a lot to do with gut health. And there's other supplements for that. Inflammation's a big piece and why our neurotransmitters could be off. And there's actually even a pathway that serotonin goes down in the presence of inflammation called kynurenine quinolinic acid. So it makes this neurotoxic chemical in the presence of inflammation. That's because bacteria will steal our tryptophan from us. So if we're inflamed, we might need new tryptophan from our diet, but we also have to turn that inflammation off. And that's another pathway why, it's another potential mechanism of how inflammation can cause depression. And as you figured, I could go on and on and on, but that is the end of my presentation, of my lecture, of my podcast. So please reach out to me if you have questions. I think, it's very useful to me to hear your questions, see what you got from this, I love how YouTube is so interactive. And generally I get good, questions and comments on YouTube, not a ton of trolls, which is fantastic. And, so ask away, ask your questions. I'm happy to answer them. Reach out to me with questions or comments or anything like that. And I look forward to sending more podcasts your way. This was a fun one. Thanks, everybody.